strict monopoly procurement where the government was responsible for its enforcement, the cotton prices were never at the same level at which we thought we would be able to enforce it. And it produces all kinds of potential distortions, which typically, in fact, economic students should be able to easily anticipate that if your price is much, much higher, it was supposed to be a scheme confined only for Maharashtra farmers. Evidently, people from Andhra Pradesh, from Madhya Pradesh will also come and sell it there. Or if the prices in adjacent states like Madhya Pradesh or Andhra Pradesh is higher, people will somehow smuggle it from Maharashtra and sell it there. So that declaration per se is operatively non-functional.
My next question was going to be about Bihar, and I'll come to the agricultural question, but it's kind of like the prohibition in Bihar.
Yeah.
You're going to find ways to sell alcohol in Bihar no matter what the law effectively says. But coming to Bihar specifically, so what have we learned, not again relevant to the 2020 protest in Delhi, but with the abolition of the APMC Act in Bihar since 2006, what has worked and what has not, and what should we learn from the abolition of the APMC Act in Bihar?
See, firstly, the APMC is a framework which is implemented differentially across all states. Their strength, their relevance, their market presence or absence, and the relative importance of those commodities in the national market as well. Because in fact, Punjab, Haryana markets are the markets where FCI is very strongly operating. It makes substantial amount of procurement from these two states, including parts of the western UP. But if the same kind of a vigor and enthusiasm is enforced maybe in parts of Madhya Pradesh or in Bihar, and FCI has a good operations there, then probably the situation in Bihar would also be different than what prevails today. This idea that having agricultural produce market committees, it is actually called the Act of Market Regulation, Agricultural Market Regulation Act. That's a proper description of it. The regulation was supposed to achieve many, many things. It's not only one thing called price. There are several things. First thing that you should, as students of agriculture, I won't say agricultural economics, that's a dubious description. But as a students of agriculture, we should realize that there is nothing like wheat. There is nothing like a unique commodity called wheat. There are different types and varieties of wheat, and each of them have different market. Each of them have therefore different ability to command a different kind of a price. So if, for example, what typically would be called closer to Lok One in the colloquial or domestic name, durum wheat, hard winter durum wheat is a variety which is preferred mostly for processed products of wheat like pasta. Now, that wheat is not same thing as any other wheat. For that matter, there is certain, if you look at the history of wheat, one which has got very fewer number, almost half the number of the chromosomes which the current bred wheat has, that is 24, which is called Emmer wheat. And we do have some which are closer to that, not really exactly same as Emmer wheat, which doesn't, when you mix that flour with water, it doesn't have the same elasticity. Consequently, your ability to make a good pasta or even for that matter chapati out of it is very, very difficult. Now that wheat is also now in great demand across the world because there are many there is a great increased probably identification of that allergy of wheat consumption, which wheat consumption induces in certain people, and that has caused the Emmer wheat to again be replanted. So Emmer wheat cannot be sold at par with the bred wheat. If you go to any ordinary shop in any reasonably good market, that grown-up market, which caters to different segments of consumers, go to a shop and then you will look for a rice. Even in older kinds of shop, different types of rice put in different bowls with different price tags. So everything is rice and everything is not a rice. That's the reason why they are put in different bowls. They carry different price. So there is nothing like an homogeneity of a homogeneous definition of a commodity called agricultural produce of wheat. So this is something that you otherwise learn in product differentiation. The things are not same. For certain kind of a property or a quality or an attribute, people are willing to pay different price. There are some people who buy it only for that attribute, like processors would like to buy it for that particular attribute. So agricultural market should be understood like any other market, just like you have got probably 10, 15 major models of car of the same company. Similarly, a farmer can probably produce different varieties, different vegetables.
In fact, should.
He should.
So, on a related note, and the background for all of you who are listening, Amol Agarwal is a professor of economics at, if I remember correctly, Ahmedabad University. And he had recently tweeted asking how many universities in India still continue to teach agricultural economics. There's a very famous columnist, and he's much more than that, of course, called Niranjan Rajadaksha. In fact, some of you might be interested to learn that he started his career as a BSc student way back when at Gokhale Institute in the 1980s. So he replied saying that Gokhale Institute is one of the few universities that still teaches agricultural economics. To which the columnist asked, what exactly is agricultural economics? How do you define it, and why do you need to study it separately? Why do you need a separate course of study called agricultural economics? Which I thought was an excellent question. And based on our discussion today, you seem to think that there is no real answer to the question.
Not only not real, in fact, the course that we have is a MA in agricultural business, which makes a lot of sense, rather than agricultural economics per se. The economic principles operative behind that business are not so dramatically different from any other economics of any other commodity or a market. So agricultural business and MA in that makes sense, because the business keeps on evolving in many of its features. And if you are trying to teach students which kind of a business currently operates in which crop, in which area of India, or for that matter, world. Like, for example, let's take an example like banana, one of the probably most extensively consumed fruit in India, of Indian origin, and probably one of the ancient crops. We produce a lot of banana and consume a lot of banana, but we are not large traders of banana. And those countries which were the agricultural geographical map are now large producers of banana, because the plantation of that kind of species seemed highly profitable to some American investors, and they started doing that. Just as they did it in case of sugarcane, they also did it in case of banana. So there are very small island countries, Caribbean islands and so on. They produce banana, and they produce, and say their banana is sold world over with an international sticker called Chiquita, because that's the company which procures it and sells it. Same is true of coffee. There are so many grades and varieties of coffee, and you can produce large number of blends out of it. And it's agricultural commodity, worldwide traded, worldwide branded, worldwide differentiated by various different attributes. Like the basic distinction in coffee market is Arabica versus Robusta. We are large producers of Robusta, but not Arabica, and Arabica price commands much, much higher price. And even now, one of the old trading center of the world at the time at which the coffee was not so extensively planted and sold across different parts of the world today, that was Makka or Mokha. We call it Mocha, but that's Makka. That's the Yemen town. It's the Yemen port where the coffee was traded and where the Arabica varieties used to arrive, and they were highly priced, and they continue to be even now. So understanding that how new markets for coffee emerged from something like picking up a select Arabica kind of a variety to a variety where it can blend different kinds and produce some standard, like it happens in case of Scotch whiskies. There are different blends. And those blends and brands sell across the world, and something like Nescafe, which is in fact something like a popped up version of a coffee, and then you crush it, and then it dissolves so finely that you don't find any traces of coffee left in your mouth. These are all ranges of coffees. Now, same crop, but with whatever kind of variations, if you can produce so many types of products out of it, that's the business. And that business has been flourishing even now. So understanding it as agricultural business makes a lot of sense. But agricultural economics, I don't know. Each of that commodity follows the similar kinds of working forces that are there behind it. So I don't know what agricultural economics is. For that matter, there is also petroleum economics. No one asks what is the petroleum economics. I think we should ask that, because probably petroleum has just the same or perhaps larger range of products to be produced in fractional distillation column than even the agriculture does. Easily 35 types of products are produced ordinarily in fractional distillation. Byproducts as well as joint products. More importantly, joint products. At different temperatures and at the different injections that are made at that temperatures, different products are derivable from it. So each industry or each class of group of commodities, which often gets recognized as an industry, has its own economic features in terms of supply, demand, prospects of technological change, prospects and possibilities of coexistence of different technology at the same time, because they are catering to different market segments, expecting or willing or being responsive to different market price or attributes, or even being having a brand loyalty and so on and so forth. So that is true for every cluster of commodities which we choose to call industry, and agriculture is just one of them, probably too large. Therefore, we call it to be a sector.
Today morning, when you were speaking about a related issue, you spoke about soil, water, and the fact that the process of agriculture is largely irreversible.
Yeah.
Are the three things that, in a sense, make it unique?
Yes, of course, because it is a supply reversibility. That means once you sow it, prospect of changing in anticipation, because suppose you thought I would be able to produce so much and I will be able to sell it at this price, something drastic happens, can I reverse it? In fact, in many industries, you can't reverse it completely, but the ease with which you can reverse it in case of engineering or manufactured product, where a slight amount of realignment of the same plant, particularly when what we call there is a product mix which is producible at a given technology, you can rejig that and switch. Doing this in case of agriculture is very, very difficult. A, process is not reversible. B, the natural conditions which facilitate that are also not so easy to control. Probably 100 years down the line, it might happen. We talked about three ingredients of it, which we by and large derive it from nature, in some cases even without paying for it explicitly. One is the soil type, second is the water, and third is the light and the temperature. These are the three ingredients which produce most of the agricultural produce. If we are able to somehow artificially develop a substitute for that and control them, as has been proven and demonstrated through variety of, from glasshouse farming to whatever control, what we call climatically controlled conditions of agricultural production. These are the ranges of technology currently available. If one looks at the way in which you look at the natural thing called plant and the way it responds to either the fertilizer dose or water requirement or water stress as well. Water is not the only thing to be supplied, but is also thing whose supply should be controlled in order to achieve certain kinds of attributes or property of fruit, for example. So these are the technologies. If they emerge and they become large enough, we talk of land being scarce, but probably we talk of the land being scarce in the sense the land piece of land on which you can construct a building. Now imagine that these buildings consist of say 37, 38 storied building where controlled temperature climatic agriculture is practicable on each floor, then it is going to be 38 times higher. So agricultural land can also be expanded. Depending on which kind of a technology you are imagining the agriculture. So there are certain features, like in case of petroleum, you can't. There is a lot of petroleum below, say, for example, 3,000 meters. But putting your rigs and digging it as deep as that is currently not feasible. Otherwise, we won't say that the petroleum is a very finite kind of a quantity. It's scarce and it will run out. In fact, that has been the scare which has always been raised almost periodically, once or twice a decade, that we are going to run out of it. So this is something which is subject to change in technology, and those who are students of economics must be, in fact, a lot more alert to the way in which technology moves in one, and not only one, but several other related fields. Like, for example, it is the growth in petroleum products, and which produces, together with petroleum, plastics of different grades, together with the rubbers of different grades. Face of agriculture has changed primarily because of the kind of micro-controlled irrigation system that we are imagining, actually using today, are possible only precisely because of plastics. Coverage of the land, that part of land which often carries many insect, pest, whatever that the farmer would like to control, just put a plastic sheet and good part of that is controlled. So open soil is not anymore practiced in many crops. Instead, it is a covered soil, and only some part of that necessary for the growth and plantation of the plant itself is in fact kept open. You can give a targeted, measured supply of water, neither excess nor in deficit, control it as it when it wants. In fact, more importantly, control it as and when plant wants it. Plant signals that it is facing a water stress, and if you have a sensor for that, the water gets released. So if you consider technology like this, yes, at the moment there is a problem that many of these processes are not so reversible, at least not as flexibly reversible as they might appear in other comparable activities like some of the manufacturing. For example, all artificial intelligence based manufacturing, there would be a lot more flexibility. 3D printing, there would be a lot more flexibility. Maybe we would be able to, if not to the same extent, we would be able to relax these present constraints and break them. And in that case, probably 50 years down the line, the face of agriculture, even in India, would be terribly different from what it is today.
So 2 points. One, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember reading that before 1973, there was actually serious talk about producing food as a byproduct of petroleum, of crude oil. Of course, the two oil shocks of 73 and 79 shut it down entirely. But the more major point you spoke about when it comes to water, agricultural exports effectively mean, especially the way we currently produce agricultural output in India, we're really exporting water as a component of agricultural produce. And a lot of people have spoken about how, in fact, it is harmful to increase agricultural produce from India, exports from India, because of the water intensive nature of our agricultural industry. To what extent do you think it makes sense? And if we have to change it, if at all, then how should we go about doing so?
Now, firstly, whenever we export something, firstly, we get a price for that.
Right.
Unless you have a complaint about the price that we get is not sufficient to represent the input cost of the water that we are using. And not every water that we use gets depleted. For that matter, if you look at the conservation of matter as a principle, water cannot be really completely destroyed. But there are water saving technologies available either. Secondly, if that water is not appropriately priced, then probably it is not pricing it appropriately might be making even present exports feasible. If we start pricing for that, perhaps that export will go. In other words, if there are price distortion in input markets for the agriculture, it might create certain kind of a comparative advantage for you. That's the reason why you export. There is also, when I'm saying comparative advantage, there is an importing country which also probably has the same kind of a problem. The water there is not, there are many countries which buy our products which are not water scarce, but water surplus. But is that water deployable for the same process, for the same product? It is in this sense we have to understand comparative advantage. There is a chain of activities, chain of inputs in which you have to locate where do you stand today. And again, like I have talked about controlling plant growth as if it is a machine, it's nature controlled machine. We would also be able to command some parts of the water cycle as they naturally operate in the nature. Like for example, probably the seawater holds a lot of prospects of various types. Recycled water that we are currently using also poses a lot of prospects. So if we consider that, saying that because this is a natural resource that is getting exported, true enough, so, but what is wrong in that? For that matter, one can also complain that the sunlight that was tappable in India is also getting exported. Doesn't make sense as an economic argument.
Okay, fair enough. Two big picture questions that I always get confused about when I think about agriculture. First, people speak and have been speaking for many years about doubling farmers' incomes. It's a periodic thing that most governments seem to come up with as a policy goal. Maybe I'm asking too simple a question, but isn't the easiest way to double farmers' incomes by reducing the amount of labor input rather than trying to improve agricultural income? That is the best way to help farmers, is to help them not remain farmers.
Yeah.
Why is this so unpopular a statement in India?
Yeah, because it's arithmetically makes a lot of sense. Only thing is how to halve the present dependent population and deploy them where. In fact, that's the reason why we bother so much about the growth of either manufacturing or the service sectors, because it is that alternative source of employment and income when created, people will leave agriculture. Now, there are certain reasons why people don't leave agriculture. A, because they don't see any other prospect than one small piece of land as the most prized kind of a position that they have, and they don't want to give it up. And there are several social connectivity of this. Like for example, like gold, land is one such market which can be more readily disposed of and command a better price. And that is often, particularly it is seen as a kind of a long-term hedging asset that the family has. And therefore, people are not so willing to depart with the kind of land rights, either notional, they are notional in the economic sense. But they believe that, yes, it doesn't give me adequate livelihood at the moment. I will try to somehow match with it. But as and when comes, suppose there is a wedding of my daughter and I would be able to sell it off, then that's an asset that they can more easily rely upon. That's why they will try to cling to that. So there are several reasons why people continue to cling to otherwise economically unviable size of holding. This is one of the causes. Second cause is we have also strangulated the nature of transactions in land market per se. And this happened partly as a result of a nature of perception that we had and the perspective that we have had way back in 60 years back, where we thought that, and this is a classical economic debate, that those who actually till it, cultivate it, if they have enough incentive and if they get possibility of investing in the land that they are operating with, then probably the productivity of land will go up much higher. So if you read the old Marshallian kind of argument, this is the argument why the actual cultivator needs to be protected with an incentive to invest part of his investable surplus in agriculture per se. But when you invest, you can't keep on investing on the same piece of land for a long time, because that's how the whole law of diminishing returns was started. So it applies to that piece of land either. So it must be able to grow. But we have another concern. That concern was the equity. So we said that yes, you should be operating commercially, you should generate surplus, you should not grow. And if you can't grow, then why will people invest in the same piece of land which cannot beyond the point pay for that investment, or cannot afford to have that kind of investment? So Land Ceiling Act on the one hand and the Tenancy Protection Acts on the other has created a kind of a peculiar situation where either way we can't escape it. If we start saying that let people own whatever size of farm, we don't apply any such condition. We don't tell Infosys that you should not hire more than 200 persons, or you should be happy with 200 persons and continue to operate with 200 persons. Similar manner, if you want to have investment in agriculture land cannot be wished away. And as I've told you, technological prospects apart, if the same land is to be used for different purposes and crops, purposes means there could be many kinds of activities which are incidental to agriculture. That's why it is often agriculture and allied activities. Because like many other industries, agriculture also has many refuge. For example, cow dung is a refuge, but which can be deployed and used in a variety of ways. This is something which, in terms of size, if you don't allow to grow, then that sector naturally starts facing a limitation. So we have to rethink of, at one point of time, we thought the absentee landlords not doing anything of the agriculture, not being party to any risk of cultivation, but simply because of the entitlement that they inherited, they used to enjoy certain income, and therefore it was thought to be an rent, the unearned income. And that was considered unjust. Good enough. But now this kind of a situation does not exist in the same way. So we have to think of large farmers, not necessarily the kulaks and people who are trying to amass wealth at the expense of someone. In fact, they are like any other industries who want to grow, invest, expand. And the prospect of that will be ultimately limited by the nature of technology at hand. Part of the labor displacement that takes place because of, as it happened in industries themselves. Mechanization makes live labor redundant because the so-called machinery-based substitute for it, or the alternative process-based substitute for it, make it a lot more economical. Therefore, having a manpower there, being dependent on manpower, is not needed. Same thing will happen in agriculture, has in fact happened in agriculture. Use of tractors and use of threshers, it's something which had changed the character of labor absorption in agriculture. And there are only peaks at which there is a huge demand for labor to do what? Not the same kind of a manual work which used to have in the 50s, in the 60s, 60 years back. But in carrying out this on a massive scale, there is a natural coincidence which is forced on us due to nature, because there is certain kind of a sowing date, certain kind of a sowing season, and there is certain kind of a maturation season. And therefore, at the type of maturation season, there is a peak demand. At the sowing season, there is a peak demand. It is only at these peak demands you require that much amount of labor. That is the need which is in fact satisfied by the relatively fluid, footloose migrant workers. And that's why you find people from Bihar, parts of Eastern UP, go to Punjab and Haryana and again retreat back. Now this another major tangled question in agricultural policy making is, whom do you protect? Agricultural farmer or the laborer working on the agricultural farmer? Because this entire Marxist ideology which said it is the labor which alone is primarily the value generating factor, and therefore protection of agricultural labor and its rights and making them at par with industries. This was a kind of a dream that we were trying to chase without realizing that except in certain characteristics they look similar, therefore you cannot have the similar kinds of laws. And probably Kerala faced the worst of it. Kerala raised their minimum wages. Now you don't find a Kerala worker working. This is a farmer and the migrant labor who are often found in Kerala agriculture. Now this kind of a paradoxical situations emerge because of the notions of the way in which productivity and investment in agriculture could be boosted, and at the same time the equity concern is restrictions that we imposed on agriculture, and that has landed us in this kind of a piquant situation that we are facing.
Speaking of equity, how and why, through what process have we made both entry and exit so difficult in agriculture? It changes state to state, but as a whole, wanting to be a farmer is a difficult proposition anywhere in the country. But worse, I would argue, wanting to not remain a farmer is equally difficult.
Yeah.
Because liquidity concerns arise in terms of selling land, the whole NA classification, and a whole variety of other problems. What is it about our political economy that has made entry and exit so difficult in agriculture?
No, again, it is more of an legacy of the past way of thinking about agriculture. Partly because of, like, for example, there are some states, Maharashtra being the most classic example. If your forefathers have not been agriculturists, you are not supposed to be an agriculturist. And in fact, you have to apply to a collector stating that I intend to undertake agriculture, and then collector can grant you a permission for 5 years, 8 years, or whatever it is. Now, from where these magical numbers come is best known only to those who framed this legislation. But this is the situation. So I am interested in agriculture. I want to be an agriculturist. I am prevented from being an agriculturist because I cannot own agricultural land. Okay, if I can't own it, can I not hire it and on a tenancy basis? Then comes another riddle. Because if I am shown to be an official tenant, and I would like to do, if I'm going to do it as a business proposition, I would like to get registered as tenant. But if you are a registered tenant for 2 or 3 or whatever number of consecutive years, depending on each state, then you are considered to be a non-evictable tenant. And therefore, no farmer will lease out your land to you as a non-evictable tenant, because he doesn't want to lose that land, control over that land. So it is a maze of laws that we have created which actually work against agriculture. And we are not willing to face this situation that, like, you have mining rights. When we mine certain minerals, no one produces them, is there. We allow some of them to be exploited, from minor minerals to major minerals like petroleum or coal. It's ultimately owned by the sovereign. And if it is ultimately owned by the sovereign has the best possible way of disposing with it. So probably there could be a bidding, and the one who pays the highest rent would be allowed to cultivate that land. This is something which can be a potential way of organizing agriculture. But of course, it is politically difficult because the existing inherited kinds of entitlements that you have, people don't want to give up with it. Again, for the same reason which I mentioned, like, for example, that entitlement is often considered by them as a kind of an insurance for all the kind of financial contingencies they meet with. May it be the sickness, or may it be a major operation, or may it be a wedding of your daughter. So it's a politically very difficult, because agricultural, any village has a mixed bag of all such kinds of cases. You draft a policy by certain intent, the intent applies to only certain people. It doesn't apply to another kind of people. So for those people, that kind of a drafting becomes a barrier. And we believe that for it at least benefits some, but probably even that benefit which is envisaged is also not all that large, so that people find it a great an opportunity to prosper. So I think there is a great deal of sense that would prevail if we do away with the former tenancy laws. Like we did it, in fact, we continued this logic, not only confined to agricultural land, but also to urban lands. And many cities and many states had this kind of a law that if you have got a tenant, you can't evict it. Bombay, for example.
Marine Drive is a classic
Marine Drive, classic example of that. So what was the solution? Solution was to make leasing out contractual with a termination date. And with that kind of a termination date, you can have a lease contract where the occupant and the user does not become a non-evictable tenant. Doing the same thing for agricultural land would in fact make a lot of change in agriculture, at least in some of the states. It is held back precisely because of this legal tangle.
In a probabilistic sense, what probability would you attach to something like this actually happening over the next 10 years or so?
For the states which have said that no agriculturist would be allowed to become an agriculturist, non-agriculturist allowed to become agriculturist, in those states, this so-called present fear that Ambanis will come and Adanis will come as if they have nothing else, no other industry left to come and invest in agriculture. It's a utter stupidity. They would at all enter. They will enter trading. Why will they enter agriculture? It's a labor-intensive job. It involves huge amount of manpower. Why will they undertake this kind of an investment? But there are also investors other than Ambani and Adani. Probably now there are only two names left of as investors in India. But this is the kind of a wrong, misplaced fear that we have cultivated in the minds of people. And someone who is coming from outside, someone who has not been a traditional agriculturist, should not and cannot become an agriculturist. This is a pride. And this pride belongs to certain communities and caste in certain states, which makes it politically more difficult to. In fact, this has also been broken in a variety of tacit ways, ranging from having a certificate of being an agriculturist in adjacent state and then come and purchase. That's another loophole. In fact, I wanted to purchase a land in Maharashtra. The only method that is I either go to Goa or Karnataka, buy a piece of land there, and then say I am an agriculturist, therefore I am entitled to purchase the agricultural land. Now, it is very stupid on part of Maharashtra to continue with this kind of a law. But probably there is a great deal of certain non-legal benefits which are coincident with it for the collector, for the landowner, and so on and so on. And there is also pride of certain communities who don't believe that other communities, other castes can become an efficient agriculturist, which is wrong, which is simply misplaced. And given the nature of technological changes that are occurring in agriculture, this old idea that farmer has that kind of an unrevealed, uncanny wisdom, no one else can have it, and agriculture is a very, very difficult, very peculiar business, is all myth, is all nonsense that often surrounds that as if agriculture is a very different kind of an animal. Even many economists often believe it. That shows what economics means. But these notions are misplaced and we should dispose with them. We should get rid of them. But happening this, as I told you, this is a politically sensitive question. And also the land might be subject to flexible uses in different senses, but one thing is sure, land cannot be transported. So it has to address whatever is the residential interest of the current type. If I have got a piece of land at some place, and if other next adjacent piece of land is on market and I can't afford to buy it at the rate that he expects, I would not like someone else to come in and buy that price. I would like it to get it prevented. This is also a tacit rivalry and a competition, but often a non-market, non-price kind of a competition that operates at the local level. Otherwise, many banks who have used even agricultural land as a collateral should have been able to dispose it off and command a good price. But people often simply prevent it for one or other reason. And it is in this sense that agricultural land market in India is highly distorted, highly controlled, and highly controlled to the extent in the sense that it simply tries to obstruct every kind of a market sense for that asset. And that's the major problem that policymakers don't want to confront so openly, so blazonly, and with a courage, because there would be a lot of local unspoken resistance.
So this raises an interesting and perhaps controversial question to my mind, in my opinion, and I might be right or wrong about this. China, Japan, and maybe South Korea are three countries in Asia that more or less got land reform. I wouldn't say perfectly right, but achieved some sort of equitable land redistribution. In China's case, after 49, in Japan and South Korea's case, after the end of the Second World War. What worries me is the one thing that was common to all of these three was a distinct lack of democracy. Is that what is required to get land reform? Even in a barest
As a broad brush political answer, yes, because the regime could enforce the kind of changes that it intended. Not necessarily that all of them were sensible. In case of China, the land was not always redistributed. In fact, the land was pooled, and people were asked to work as if you are an employee of that so-called either cooperative, which was even worse, because that agriculture at that level of technology was not capable of sustaining that sort of a manpower, which China pretended that it can. And that caused the famine, in fact, very worse kind of greatly for famine. But in other cases, the situation was not same. In case of, particularly in case of Japan, there was in fact a much large and much extensive kind of a manufacturing sector that was expanding. And Japanese were at that time were called copycats, but they turned out to be much smarter copycats. They were investing both in technology development as well as in developing their own manufacturing base. They did not bother about concentration of market power beyond the point. And that's the way in which they designed their trade and industry policy together. MITI was effectively an arbitrator in a number of things within an industry disputes. So each of them has a different kind of a story. So, but coming to the point where ability of the agriculture to get rid of the surplus manpower that it has, and it is rendered surplus because of A, technological change, and B, sheer size of growth in the population. If the land mass cannot be expanded, we have partly expanded that by cutting down the forests, etc. But still, that is far inadequate. And given that kind of a population pressure, the only alternative is to, in fact, pump out that from agriculture per se, not necessarily in cities. Had there been a growth of something that was popularly implemented, again, partly by government mandate. In China, immediately after 1978 reform, there was a surge of what was called rural enterprises, which was a part exposure to the kinds of skills which the erstwhile farming population were required to acquire. And then they could, as the wave came, they could easily got up with that, catch up with that kind of an opportunity. Now, same kind of thing happens in our case, but it happens by the natural growth of, sluggish growth of manufacturing and major manufacturing centers as they happen. Firstly, there is a possibility of getting out of agriculture by selling land for non-agricultural purposes. That's one major process, which usually happens in all big cities, even the class 2, class 3 kinds of towns. But this prospect, which is in fact a very good prospect currently, that if we allow commercial nature of agribusiness in rural areas to change, there is a lot of scope of growth of service sector within rural areas. Because there are a lot of services which agriculture itself requires just as much as manufacturing sector requires. That service sector should get articulated around those major agricultural clusters. And this is something that we are preventing from happening because we don't allow agriculture to become prosperous in terms of ability to generate surplus through technological change. So you can dispose of that labor, employ them where, because there are, in fact, this is something that you can witness in some areas of agriculture, which are prosperous areas of agriculture. Like, for example, there are many horticultural crops grown in Maharashtra, where most of the labor working on the farms is in fact migrant labor. But those who are trading, who are involved in transport, in trading, in packaging, in maintenance of equipment, it is the local young labor which is in fact getting employed there. So there is a possibility of generating a service sector around agricultural activity, particularly one which is a more surplus generating, flourishing, process-based agricultural activity. then this whole question of pumping out agriculture, you are pumping out not from villages, but pumping out from agriculture per se. And that process needs to be accelerated. Where this has happened, in fact, there has been a growth of all sides, both agricultural as well as the non-agricultural employment opportunities and income are increasing in the rural areas.
Extent is improvement in road connectivity and cold chain storage.
Huge. In fact, for any industry, in agriculture particular, because when it's a perishable product, when it is a product which is to be taken for processing, the infrastructural support like road connectivity is extremely valuable. And you also require an aggregator. That's what I mean by, suppose we have, as you can experience this in many parts of India now, Amul is most cited example, but you can find many replicas of that sort, not probably having the same valuable brand as Amul. But if you look at their activities, it is based on the same principle. It's pulling together, aggregation of certain kind of a product is necessary for developing a processing industry for that product. I cannot put up a plant for, suppose I have got even 10 cows. Me putting up a pasteurization plant and the whole village putting a pasteurization plant makes a very different sense. So pulling together resources for the purposes of processing is a necessary thing. Aggregation is a necessary thing. It is this job which is not necessarily done by farmers or need not be necessarily done by farmers if they do it good enough, as it happens in Sanand, like Anand. But it's not necessary. In fact, you can see that a private investor from Maharashtra, let me quote this example because both these are the forms in which market has responded in spite of the so-called regulatory structure on markets. Milk processing takes place in Varna, which is under cooperatives. Just hardly 60 kilometers away, there is a milk processing that takes place in a private sector, Chitale's. Both of them are good brands. They have well-established market brands. Their fresh milk, but the packaged milk is sold in large cities. Varna, for example, collects milk, puts them in the cold storage kind of facility plants and just chills them, transfers them to the tankers, which are also cold chain tankers, takes them to near Thane, pack the milk there rather than milk packing it here, and then pack it for the entire region of Mumbai and around. Chitales do it for the same manner, but they packed it where it is collected, and size is quite comparable. 60,000 for Varna, 55,000 farmers for Chitales. So it is not really the investment is cooperative or investment is private. In fact, as a cooperative, Varna has a much more comfortable financial support position. At least at the beginning of it, 40% of, nearly 50% of the capital came from the government itself. Whereas in case of Chitales, it is entirely their self-earned surpluses reinvested back into the industry. So you have both these kinds of models which are feasible. Both of them are processing. All of these farmers are just equally happy because they have got an assured market in certain market centers where milk is to be delivered every day. It must reach the market center sometime early morning at 3 o'clock and should reach the consumer or customer by 6 or 7. Now, just look at the chain of distribution from transport, from packaging, for the retail distribution and so on. So that's what I mean when I say that standardize a product, make a process product. There is a lot of employment opportunity around it. And the basic ingredient is generated as a farm output, that is the milk. So now the way in which farmers used to, in fact, tend cows, kind of breeds that they use for this purpose, everything is primarily driven by a technological change. So if we look at this prospect, believing that somehow we must be custodians of the, and that's the kind of a museum of agriculture that we must now conserve in India is a wrong idea. That's what was achieved effectively by policy, even though it was not its objective. Another bad example of unintended consequence.
Okay. This name is probably not going to make any sense to any of the people listening, but one of the best documents that I read about agricultural reform was a small essay written by a person called Du Runcheng. I think he now works with IFPRI, if I'm not mistaken. But it detailed how China achieved agrarian reform after Chairman Mao's death and with the Anhui Agreement of 1978. And what impressed me the most about it was A, the pragmatism, but B, the incrementalism. So it was baby steps taken in local areas and then slowly but surely expanded. Can we do the same in India? And if not, why not?
I won't say we are not entirely doing it. We don't try to make it public. We keep it secret in many respects. In fact, if you go to Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Madhya Pradesh today, many of such kinds of baby steps are actually implemented without much fanfare about it.
Okay.
Like, for example, there are operatively, whatever be the Tenancy Act, operatively, people lease in land, involve those families in some other allied business, so they don't complain. They are there around it. Large tracts of farms. These are the traders who have a good knowledge of agricultural markets, of the produce that they produce. They have, in fact, developed very large tracts of farms ranging to something like 1,500 to 1,800 hectares. They created, in fact, within their farms for the harvest and transportation, they have roads which are small roads where at least the Maruti van can easily move. So just as it used to happen in case of sugarcane industries of the 1940s and 50s in Maharashtra, where Walchans or Somayas would put a railway track inside their own sugarcane plantation farms. Similar things have started happening, though we don't advertise them, but they are actually happening. Because beyond the point, if some commercial opportunity comes, howsoever illegal it might look on paper, people will somehow engage themselves in it because it is worth paying for it. It is worth an income opportunity which they will not give up. So I think we are changing. Good part of horticulture in Maharashtra also operates in a similar manner. If we legally permit it, we are not forcing it, but just legally permit that any non-agriculturist can become an agriculturist on tenancy basis. And this tenancy does not necessarily mean the loss of entitlement to the land you currently own and operate. Many people will come in. At least there is a possibility that will be opened up. See, whether people will come in also depends on several other things. This is something which often happens in case of evaluating reforms, as it happens in case of Bihar. They abolished because they abolished something which anyway was not so much existent. Did the agricultural market system in Bihar change? Did the crop pattern really change so that something else could happen? It is wrong to believe that just because this regulatory market regulation, namely you cannot sell it in beyond the designated marketplaces, because it is removed, everything will. This is also an illusion. The commercial opportunity consists of many facets, of which one facet happens to be whether are you allowed to sell it on a different basis than what is currently legally permissible. That's this all these reforms are about. Contract farming, separate act has been made, as if contract farming has not been existed. Of course, it has been there operating for years. For that matter, when I become a member of a cooperative, say sugar cooperative, and if I am a registered member with say 3 acres in my name, and if I show it to be cultivating sugar, it's my obligation. There's an implicit contract. I would be, in fact, processing it with the cooperative factory. It's a contract farming. All these suppliers of milk to Chitales or Varnas or Anand, all of them are contract farming. So contract farming is not a new thing, firstly. Secondly, people think that when you draft a law, you must provide it in a foolproof manner.
It's never happened.
Which they think in terms of legally foolproof manner. Again, losing the sense of business. Business runs primarily on trust and confidence and not on the letters of law. That's the reason why something which is there in letters of law, people violate it because it makes a business sense. So if the contract makes a business sense, this whole thing, what if he promised but he did not pay, then what do I do? As if we have got a solution today. We don't have a solution today. Agricultural Marketing Board, I was in fact consulting committee chairman of that. Suppose a regulated market, a farmer goes and complains that he paid me the right, not the right kind of a price, and he failed to make me the payment in time. What can that Agricultural Regulation Market Committee do? Register a complaint, refer it to a department. Can they by itself order it to be paid? No way. So is there a recourse available if suppose in regulated market you don't get a contracted or the contractually obligatory price? Is there any mechanism for ensuring that There is no mechanism. But now people believe that contract farming has been introduced, therefore advantage and advantage will come for the lack of any other worthwhile industry to invest. And farmer will be looted, farmer would be exploited. This is a mythology. If the farmer gets deceived once, why will he enter there? He will choose some other option. The whole question is, what other option? Presently, because of the nature of market regulation in certain areas, selling it elsewhere was forbidden. That does not mean it was completely adhered to. In fact, all the weekly markets that are held at a village level, you don't find any enforcer. But for the notion's sake, there is some Artya who is going to be operating it under his license. One of the major concerns which economic students should have about regulated markets is that this regulatory market mechanism, in fact, created a kind of a cartel inside the regulated market. You try to enter this market to become a registered trader, and then you will notice how much volume you can get, even if you get a registration. To get that registration sanctioned from the committee, you would be required to pay quite a heavy sum. Try to enter a Washi market like this, you would be required to pay at least 1 crore to get a license. So it is the preventing barrier that has been created for entering. So you talked about entry and exit. It is this entry and exit, not only for the farmer, but also for a trader who would like to be a trader in agricultural commodity, which is in fact what is pinching. And this is doing away with these kinds of restriction. It's something which is a welcome aspect of these reforms.
I suppose it's going to make sense only to Punekars, although I don't know, maybe applicable in other parts of the country as well. But speaking about getting access to the rickshaw drivers union outside Pune airport or railway station, used to be the same.
Yeah, the same thing.
Same logic. Okay. When I was a student at Gokhale Institute.
Now, coming back to the question that you asked. Yes, there were baby steps and it was a gradual. In fact, in most of the cases, something which is change in direction, shift in focus and emphasis, even goals, one has to be cautious. One has to buy time in some cases, allow something else to emerge so that you don't have to spend too much energy to convince people that this is a good thing to happen. One feature of these 3 reform bills is, which is not known, is that we have been trying to achieve these reforms for last 20 years.
I would say longer.
Much longer than that, but at least officially, if you start looking at what union government did from 1999 onwards, every kind of an effort has been made, so much so that some of the states have, in fact, actually partly implemented it. The best example being Maharashtra. But people don't know that. They think that as if government, by its own imagination, some flash of wisdom in a dream, they came up with this kind of. That's not true at all. In fact, those who can, you can access these documents on internet. 2013 probably, Planning Commission has made a report on the way in which agricultural marketing must be reformed. In fact, a good chapter of that has been drafted by a Maharashtra Secretary, Agriculture Secretary, Principal Secretary at that time, Mr. Goyal. You'll find the same provisions there. They are talking of same reforms, that means abolish this regulation, allow alternative markets to emerge, give various opportunities of differentiated forms of contract in the marketplace. This is precisely what we have been talking about for the last 20 years. And all that this legislation did was, state governments were expected to take this initiative and move forward. Many of the state governments simply refused because some of the states, those who are in fact facing this basic fountainhead of agitation, they are comfortable with the kind of a arrangement that has existed for the Artyas. And Artyas are not now sure that what if that MSP procurement business is shifted or closed. That's first part, shifted, potential threat. Government can assure and it will ensure that yes, we are going to buy at MSP. Of course, government is going to run all those PDS kinds of schemes, I will call it Annapurna or whatever, or Food for Work 78 label. But if it starts procuring, or simply if it proposes that let state governments, if they are so keen about their turf called agriculture being intruded by the union government, let them run their own scheme of procurement and trade that procured surpluses, and then they will test the market. They will have a taste of market. They won't do
you're
it.
Basically saying decentralized FCI. I mean, along those lines.
Yes. Why only FCI? Let state government have their own FCI, and anyway. What is the business that we are currently operating? This is again a legacy of 60s. Who used to produce wheat and rice of the surplus type? Only some states. So Food Corporation of India used to go there, procure it from market. And then there used to be some scheme of the union government which said that we can sell it in public distribution system. If the states want it, they should take this and sell it there. States were not willing to incur even this transportation cost. So suppose the wheat is procured in, say, Hisar or Hoshiarpur, and if it is kept in the godown there, the state government should for the transport cost. How will we send it? Because we don't have financial provisions for this. Now let's, in fact, throw the ball back into the state government court and say that if you want to operate it, protect your farmers, also protect your poor on your own. If you are currently using so much amount of quantum to be operative for the PDS, we'll give you that amount directly. Let's abolish FCI. Each state has its own version of FCI and let them operate with it. And ask for the center, ask the union government for the financial support needed for this. Just see how many state governments will jump on this wagon. Very few will.
Hardly anybody will afford to. Okay. So when I was a master student over here at the Gokhale Institute, there was a standing joke that the only way to pass the agricultural paper was to write the name C.H. Hanumanta Rao at least once on every page. I don't know who the current economist is who will qualify along these lines, but outside of the typical people, so Ashok Gulati is a name that comes to mind, Surinder Sood is another name that comes to mind, but outside of these economists, who are the people we should be reading more of as students of Indian agriculture?
To dispense with this idea, because I talked about equity, there was great fancy at one point of time that take the surplus land from the large landlords and distribute it among the people. So you will have created for everyone some land entitlement and everyone will grow that plot of land and make a survival. And this was often seriously thought as a solution to the nature of poverty. That this is a myth and this is an unfeasible kind of a proposition has been in fact demonstrated very succinctly and ably in Poverty in India of Dandekar and Rath. Okay? Gokhale Institute product again, though under Ford Foundation at that time, because he was with ISP. But similar thing, just in case of labor intensive technology, that can solve the unemployment problem. These two myths which are very popular and often sold in the name of Mahatma Gandhi. I don't know when Mahatma Gandhi said this and why he said this if he said this, but they have been very ably dealt with in this one single volume called Poverty in India. In those times, people used to discuss what should be the optimal size of farm. And is there something like an optimal size of farm? Because again, coming to the legal failure, we also have laws which are supposed to be the laws against fragmentation of land. But we know that we can't arrest it beyond the point. At least on the mutilated record, that means the division among the inheritors, the average size has been dwindling all across the states, all states. So, and why is it not getting a market where everyone who believes that he can make a survival of this is cultivating it? No, they are holding it for the purposes which I already mentioned. So open up land market so that even with this kind of so-called fragmentation, there will be a more reasonable market for land and possibly that in a better alternative way by someone else who affords the other investment, rather than hoping that that small plot holder will have ability and somehow you make him able by whatever small fragmentary support that, like for example, IRDP. You have got a plot, okay, then I will give you a buffalo. As if that buffalo and that plot taken together is going to lift himself above the poverty line. All these non-viable kinds of ideas which have been very popular because that they have that kind of a shade of equity and shade of state support. But there is a limit to state support in any economic activity. Every economic sector has its own dynamism, substantially conditioned by technology and substantially framed by a kind of opportunity people are able to see it as an opportunity. So if you prevent agriculture from either of these sources of change and growth, nothing can happen, and not many agricultural economists write in this spirit because that's the way they have been trained and they refuse to think beyond the point, and all of them tacitly believe that everyone who is a farmer today should continue and prosper as a farmer with the same size of land or whatever turnover. And it can be achieved by state intervention, which is an unimaginable kind of a goal to pursue.
Another name that I wish more people had heard of, in fact, I myself have forgotten his first name right now, but Ladezhinsky. I don't know if I'm pronouncing
Wolf
his name
Ladezhinsky.
right. Wolf Ladezhinsky, thank you. So he, I think, like somewhere in the middle, and most of his work, especially in India, was on extension services. What is it that today we get wrong about extension services in agriculture? Where have we failed to listen to the lessons of Ladezhinsky?
What we get wrong with is the idea that extension service workers supplied by and extension services supplied by Department of Agriculture is very useful and is worth the delivery, which is often wrong.
Okay.
Firstly, agriculture department is itself overridden by several other things like supply of seed. There is a regulatory mechanism on supply of seed, supply of fertilizer, supply of pesticide, supply of insecticides. Everything is under agricultural departments, and good part of the agriculture staff is often busy when these operations, agricultural operations begin with this. Agricultural service extension is an idea that actually originated in US and practiced pretty successfully because it was a land surplus country, but there was labor scarce country, and they invited people to come and cultivate. But those migrants who came from different parts of the world, principally from Europe, they didn't have knowledge of agriculture. So this whole idea of community college and community university, which we call agriculture universities now, is a model that we borrowed from US. Yes. Not that the other didn't have it. Britishers themselves established agricultural colleges to improve agriculture. But extension service is a good concept, noble concept, but you need a staff of that size and skill. And also the technological exposure and ability and the know-how and which they can really genuinely disseminate. In this regard, I think we have too much highly exaggerated expectations of the agricultural department personnel that we have. A, they are overburdened with several other regulatory activities. Secondly, extension services, if you try to give it to the farmers, there must be a good rapport and a confidence among both of them. In fact, this is one of the idea that someone who has been doing this business for generations together knows that business better. This is one most popular misconception. Because they have been doing it for generations, they know certain things which are handed down from a generation, and those are right only in those matters where the things have not changed. Where the things have changed, you need to open up. And therefore, you find that new entrepreneurs in agriculture perform differently, much better. They don't heed to the so-called traditional advice. At one point of time, Tasgaon, half of that was, and it continues to be still, a famine and a drought-prone area, water scarce area. And at that time, it was believed that the grapes requires a lot of water. It was called a bagaiti. Bagaiti, often in India as well as in Maharashtra, means a lot of water. It was a technological impetus that was provided by some private consultants like Dabholkar, and that was through Draksha Bagaitdar Sangha. Then people started realizing that you can think of the same crop very differently. I doubt whether agriculture department, except probably for campaigning for a soybean as a popular alternative to jowar, it has been able to do this. Nothing of that sort, of the comparable sort, is to the credit of several agricultural departments. I'm not saying that all of them are worthless, but they themselves must be able to keep pace with what is doable and what is not doable technologically. And more than extension service per se, one extension service is extension of exposure, whether now through internet or otherwise. But my own experience has been, when we were with the Agricultural Marketing Board, we used to give some small grant for farmers to go and attend the so-called Agro Expo, agricultural exhibition in Israel. Seeing is believing. Looking at equipments, looking at the way it could be done, you fund some people like this, they will start doing it, and there will be a demonstration effect that will spread. this mode of functioning in extension services is applied, then probably could have worked better. But though we tried this as a model, but failed in with many pitfalls, and because the staff was not trained, the inputs they were not adequately equipped for conducting that kind of scheme. Again, whether this should be a state job, I have a doubt about this. This is not necessary. It's like saying that if you want to learn about petroleum, then the state government should allow you a special seat in UDCT. It's not needed. There are a number of things, there are a number of ways in which you can learn about new tricks of trade. And exposing farmers and Gram Panchayat leaders for these tricks of trade, particularly in water conservation, harnessing, harvesting, where the extension service is probably the most needed. And that can be done even without agriculture department. And that can be done with the use of the media. And this whole idea of kiosk, which were supposed to disseminate this information, go and check what kind of a state of affairs we have got in kiosk and how much it has been able to persuade people. Whereas people who saw it, someone doing it successfully, went there, built up a rapport, learned from it. There are some now newspapers like Agro1 carries stories. People read to that, respond to that, find out, and start doing it on their own. So I think extension service is a good notion, but it should not be necessarily considered as a departmental activity alone.
All right, two questions that have nothing to do with agriculture, and then we'll take some questions from the students. So one is, if today you somehow got the chance to do your undergraduate degree all over again, knowing what you do now, how would you approach studying differently today?
Not an easy answer. The question is, in fact, not that complicated. But answer is complicated. Firstly, the economic student should be persuaded to think of economic problem as a businessman would look at it first. Because the economics is about either a producer or a consumer. The way in which they think, they react, they are likely to react, the extent to which they are likely to depart from established norms. This way of imagining yourself, putting yourself in that shoe, is a first basic essential training that we lack. It doesn't matter. I don't think it really matters if I know and derive Roy's identity accurately. But if I am able to know the way in which business people are likely to react in such kind of things, which even business community is not homogeneous, it is heterogeneous. Yeah. There are people of different sizes, people of different kind of past and legacy issues, whether in terms of loans, bank access, market access. Getting knowledge of this is very important. So being a student of economics means being a student of economy the way any sector works and a collection of sector work. Of course, collection of sector is a lot more complicated because it's a more intractable kind of an issue, what we call macroeconomics. But at least to begin with, developing a sense of what would happen to a particular sector if certain kind of a change occurs. I think that should be the focus of teaching and training students in economics, which we often avoid by giving them certain kinds of parroting, which doesn't really equip them to think of economic problems or economic situations in a sensible way. So imparting and instilling this kind of a sense of way business functions, either on a producer side or a consumer side or in a distributive network, like some industries, distribution network plays a lot more role than the producers and consumers. Think of pharmaceuticals, for example. So we are not given the exposure to these kinds of layers of business, and that should be the way in which I would expect I would receive a training, so that whatever number of years we wasted in getting it trained by ourselves through the exposure and with a hard-earned experiences, I think it can be very easily imparted. I'm not saying that therefore it should be same thing as management school or a business school, but management and business school are good in this respect more, if at all they are doing this. I'm not sure whether they too also do this, but I think this is something which is doable, and that's the way I would like to learn. And put mathematics, statistics is primarily to make sense of data. Whatever kind of data, good or bad, good, well collected or not so well collected, ability to judge the quality of data with which you should make an opinion about something like being a policymaker is an art. And to practice that art sensibly, you need to understand that whatever quantitative techniques that we teach, only to that purpose and to that extent. Greater refinements don't necessarily produce huge results in this respect. But we obsessively think that as if I teach a topology course and then you'd be producing a better economist. It doesn't happen.
Okay, and my final question, I've been saying this for many years now, but especially in 2020, examinations are just pointless and a complete farce. What should we change as academicians about how we test students?
Again,
Easy
I
question.
not easy answer to give, because see, the classes that you address or we teach are a lot more heterogeneous. Therefore, the teaching has a purpose and the learning should also have a purpose. Most of the time, I don't know whether on either side there is a sense of purpose. Students don't know why they are learning what they are learning.
Yeah.
And teachers often don't realize why they are teaching what they are teaching. And if these questions are asked, then probably the answers would be more easy to come by, because everyone, depending on her or his wish or aspiration or desire to learn, can tune oneself to so many sources of learning and opportunities which are now available. When I was a student, we used to think of some books where we would consider ourselves greatly fortunate if we can have at least a photocopy of that book, or at least I can read that book originally. Now, this is not anymore a constraint. And probably on internet, on YouTube, or many channels run by as open courseware by many universities, to be very honest and blunt, I think we as a teachers have got sufficiently redundant.
Exactly.
And we have to, in fact, look at ourselves with a situation where all these are the open options to the students. If they don't exercise it, we can always simply advise them to exercise that option. Secondly, if they have difficulty in making sensible use of that option, can we be of some help? That's where the teachers actually are. And I think this has been the case. Probably with internet, it has become a lot more cheap, open, and much widely accessible. But otherwise, who had prevented which student from reading a book and being perplexed by what this book is trying to say, and come to a teacher and say that I don't understand this, please explain this. In fact, good course design is one where you recommend a book and teacher gives an introductory outline of what is there in the book. Students come with a prepared reading of that book and ask the teacher what they have not understood. That's the best way of running a course. And doing it on a distance basics like this is a lot more cheaper than this.
So we call that a flipped classroom.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, for everybody who's attending this call, so the first time that I attended Aptesa's class was back in the year it's been 20 years, 2000. And I've been hearing since then from my batchmates, from people I've taught since I started teaching at Berkeley Institute, कि Aptesa की class समझ में नहीं आते. For those of you who don't understand Hindi, Aptesa's classes are not understandable. That's the point. What you want to do is leave the class thinking I haven't understood, and then ask, well, what do I need to read to understand it better? So if you're, not just for today's talk, but ever if you're attending Aptesa's classes, the idea is to leave confused. That's an indication that you've succeeded. And then you start to read. A bad class is one where you leave with no doubts, because then your job as a student is over. So if you are confused right now, that's the point. And take that as a starting off point. And after that, whether it is Aptesa, whether it is me, whether it is Saili or anybody else, we'll try to help you out. But leaving with doubts is a sign of a successful class, not the other way around. But right, that being said, I think it's necessary to...
One supplement, yes. I didn't answer it explicitly. You asked about how we should evaluate the examination. The one general thumb rule which I can give about the existing system of examination is that the questions which are asked in examination are not the questions that you face in real life. So just forget if you don't answer them correctly, doesn't matter. Probably you would have good real life questions and answers.
Fair enough. All right. So I haven't seen any of the questions that have come up. Let's take a look. Oh, and there are only two. Wonderful. Okay, so the first one is India is one of the biggest producers of sugarcane in the world. Why has ethanol not caught up as a major fuel here like it has in Brazil? I'm not sure that is a good idea, Rajashni, but that's me answering the question. Do you think if subsidies are offered to vehicles who use ethanol, ethanol production will rise?
Subsidies will rise.
If subsidies rise, will ethanol production rise and use as a source of fuel?
Oh, it's a very tangled problem because there are two lobbies. One is a sugar lobby, which wants to produce ethanol, but they want it to be on a much larger scale, to which the present vehicles where that would be used, the blended ethanol blended petroleum would be used, are not tuned to. So looking at Brazil, because Brazil made many changes for that purpose. Eventually, probably now, using ethanol directly may not be sensible. If you can use ethanol to recharge batteries, that might be perhaps more sensible. There is a tussle between the oil companies who produce this blended ethanol, at what price they can and they should buy, vis-a-vis the sugarcane processors. That's the reason why it doesn't usually progress beyond 10%, because they already have very large volume, because oil industry is highly integrated industry. You start importing crude oil, start processing it, and then petroleum processing is bound to create certain kinds of outputs, a lot more, both joint as well as byproducts. So once they have been tuned to certain kind of a size, they cannot make a downward or upward revision very quickly. So unless there is a stable policy, neither of these industries cannot will come to an agreement. Apparently, they have come to an agreement of something like 10%, to 15% it can be raised
For blended.
for blended.
And Jayavardhar asked a question that is very close to my heart. How much of futures markets operations, particularly in agricultural commodities, is hampered by too much of government intervention? And if the answer to that is a lot of it, how should it change?
See, futures markets are feasible only in certain kinds of crops, not all crops. Perishables, very difficult. Again, dependent on processing technologies. Like, for example, you can easily make a otherwise perishable looking kind of a product with a shelf life of 6 months. There again, something like a future or a forward can take shape. Future and forward in India is looked at with a great suspicion. That is a speculation, and speculation is a bad word, because speculation generates profits and profit is a bad word. So that's the reason why some prices shoot up and then people only whisper that it is because of the forward trading the prices have shot up. No one would care to ask why will it happen and did it really happen, and people will put a ban on the forward trading. This has happened in case of wheat. This frequently happens in case of onion.
Correct.
And there is also a very peculiar notion that some commodities are essential, as if there are essential oils. And if that gets vaporized, then the whole economy is going to be in shambles. That's not the case. There is nothing like an essentiality of it. There's a relative scarcity at a point of time or over a period of time. Many times policymakers are required to attend to the shouting that takes place at a point of time, but they have to be clear that they have to address the questions which are more over a period of time. If they keep on all the time answering at a point of time kind of a emergency, then over a period of time kind of a solution never emerges. That's what happened in case of onions. If onions are expensive, people will not eat onion bhajis, pakodas. They will eat kebab, maybe cabbage pakodas, or palak pakodas, which were in fact pakodas at one point of time. They are now in disuse or ran out of fashion, but that will come back. So people can invent their own substitutes. So you don't have to run around and say that somehow onion should be available to the poor and believing that it is only poor who eats onion. Is a wrong notion. But this is something which is preventing something like a forward market. Forward market requires institutional mechanism. It also requires huge amount of infrastructural support, which makes forward trading feasible, sensible, because it's actual physical delivery. It's not like a kind of a one entry in a SEBI account will take care of it. So it requires a huge investment. And again, the entire investment need not be done by the government. The traders themselves will undertake the government. Government has to float a credible platform which will conduct just as in case of share markets. There is a platform, there is an arbitrator, there is a margin requirements, and that by and large shapes the way in which demand and supply fluctuates through the day, through the days, through the months, and then see whether anything more than that is required at all. But that kind of an evolution of policy has not emerged because forward marketing is looked down upon and with a great deal of suspicion and aversion for speculation. And that's really taking out the very spirit of forward markets.
Great. Okay, sir. Thank you so much for your time. All right. Thank you, guys. We move from agriculture to the world of investment banking tomorrow. Deepanjali will be speaking about